That to me was the most remarkable experience I've ever had because it was about changing minds, but also changing hearts.
Why should we look at housing through the gendered lens? Why is this important and why should we care? How do we change hearts and minds in order to help fix the housing sector? As with any social issue or call for reform, the greatest challenge is not finding evidence, but changing minds. A researcher can write a compelling report, but without the support of the community and its leaders, change is virtually impossible. I'm Dr. Kate Raynor, the Director of the Centre for Equitable Housing at Per Capita, and I have been researching Australian housing for over a decade. In that time, I have led research projects on older women's homelessness, experiences of stigma and housing satisfaction in public housing stress during COVID-19, access to crisis accommodation for survivors of family violence, just transitions in Australia's renewable energy zones, and perceptions of higher density housing. And in 2026, I'm adding another feather to my cap: podcast host. I'll bring you along my journey as I speak to experts from around the country and the world in an effort to detangle the ongoing housing crisis, but through a gendered lens, in hopes of finding solutions towards a new equitable housing system. What could a gender-equal housing system look like? How would we know it if we saw it? That's what we'll find out in Season 2 of Homes Not Houses. Last week, I was joined by economist Dr. Leonora Rees to help identify the cause of the housing crisis and why it impacts women disproportionately. On this week's episode of Homes Not Houses, I'll be taking a look at how we could begin pivoting the housing conversation towards women and begin influencing both the public and government to care about gendered housing. Joining me to help unpack these important questions is Canadian policy expert Professor Carolyn Whitzman. An urban planner and community activist, Carolyn called in from across the pond to give her take on how gender informed her work in the Canadian housing space.
Just at the very basic level, in what ways is housing gendered? Are you likely to need different housing or have different access to housing based on gender? And you've picked up, you're saying one of those elements there, but are there other things to think about too?
Well, as I get older and older, I get more and more intersectional, and that actually sometimes makes me a bad feminist in terms of gender issues, because so much of it at the bottom line has to do with income. And when you're looking at groups in Canada, and I'm sure it's the same in Australia, who are at risk of, let's look first at people who are in unaffordable and inadequate because it's too small or it's badly repaired housing. Absolutely the number one group at risk are single moms. So, yeah, women. And the vast majority of those single moms are Black or Indigenous or visible minority. So they're already dealing with discrimination as single moms, but they're also dealing with racist discrimination and also may need services that are culturally appropriate as well as gender appropriate. So it has to do with the need for particular, if they're single moms, sizes, like, 2, 3+ bedrooms. But it also, and it has to do with cost. And it also has to do with, is there childcare co-located or, are there schools nearby? And it also has to do with, is the space culturally safe? Which is a really hard thing to come in with, like a thermometer or, a COVID stick or something like that and go, culturally safe. Oh, I'm sorry, not culturally safe. So it always gets really complicated really quickly. In Canada, we're talking more and more about women and gender diverse people. And really where the rubber hits the road is the proportion of young people who are aging out of care, who are gender diverse. Not that there aren't gender diverse older people, there definitely are, but there you have the conjunction of youth and transphobia and, again, where are the cheap supportive places with the kind of services that you need in order to thrive? There may well be mental health issues which have to do with discrimination during that person's childhood, etc. So my interest in gender and housing started out as a fairly, I wouldn't say uncomplicated, but a focus on, I was focusing on gender-based violence, and one of the aspects of staying in an unsafe home situation, whether it's an abusive spouse or an abusive landlord or something like that, is, whether you have affordable housing options, whether you have enough income. But as I get older and I hear more and more stories, it has to do with so many other grounds of discrimination or of identity that go above and beyond gender.
Yeah. I think about this a lot too, and I want to go back to your comment that you're a bad feminist, because that's such a jarring concept coming from you, Carolyn. But I do see it because it's this question of intersectionality, and is gender the most important lens, and should we be pitting them up against each other? Probably not. But my question is there value in advocating for gender equal housing, or is putting gender at the front of that term kind of drowning out other forms of intersectionality, and we should be thinking about something else? Like, how do you feel about this concept of gender equal?
It's such a good question, Kate, and part of the reason why it's a good question is I don't have a simple answer to it. So Canada's had a national housing strategy since 2017, and it's coming up for renewal in 2027, which is why I was having this meeting. It's now the end of 2025, so we need to get cracking on it. And I think it's fair to say that a lot that was in Canada's first national housing strategy just didn't work. And one of the things that didn't work, although I'm not sure whether it has to do with the way that we count things, or whether it has to do with that particular measurement, is that we said, first 25 and then 33% of the housing would be for households led by women and gender diverse people. Great. Awesome. Mm-hmm. There wasn't enough affordable housing created. That was the main problem. The programs created new definitions of affordability, or, were terribly private sector oriented. And so to me, a much more telling statistic is in the biggest program, which was like NRAS. It was a private market purpose-built rental program, $55 billion. Which is a lot in financing. 3% of the homes were affordable to people in housing need, the vast majority of whom are low income. A disproportionate number are women, 3%. And they were all fucking studio apartments. Pardon my language. You'll have to cut that. They were all studio apartments. So fail. And every once in a while they'd go, oh, yeah, we've done this program for the WCA, and we've done this program with another women serving agency. And it's like, but you're putting the minority of your money in housing that's not appropriate for low-income women. The end, there's got to be a better way of counting this, or of conceiving of the program. So, is it important? Is it a distraction? It's important. And in some ways, what we probably should have been measuring is, are we creating the right, who needs what housing, where, and at what cost? And are we creating housing that's affordable, and housing that's big enough, and at the end of that is housing that is by agencies serving women, or housing that is specifically suited for single parent families, which are mostly single mother families. So, I'm speaking out of frustration in trying to get that kind of gender-based analysis. And I think the strategy was great at lip service. Geez, it spent a lot of time talking about gender and intersectionality, but it didn't deliver.
Well, yeah, I mean, 3% affordable housing in a scheme that is about affordable housing is horrifying.
So let's start with that failure.
Yes.
6 failures on. Let's look at gender.
Yeah, so interesting. So part of what's inspired this podcast is a project that Capita is doing with Australians investing in women. And we've been tripping around Australia talking to people from philanthropy, from private sector, from government, all over the place about gender lensing housing decisions. And there's a lot of support for it. But then there's also a lot of people who are like, look, we work in a social housing system with scarce resources, with a lack of funding generally, with all of these boundaries against what we can put into funding rounds. We want to think about gender, but it's just impossible with all of the other things going on there. So I kind of like this idea of, let's start with, are we building the right things in the right places at the right cost that is appropriate, and then think about who's delivering it at the end of that pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely need to look at the outcomes in terms of women. Part of the problem in Canada, and I'd say this is a problem that's greater in Canada than it is in Australia, is that there are about 8,000 non-market housing providers in Canada, social housing providers, counting public housing, counting nonprofit cooperative housing, and counting other forms of social housing. About 25 of them, and I'm being generous there, of whom 2 are agents, housing providers for women, can do a 800 home development. And if we're going to increase vastly the amount of non-market housing, we need 800 home developments. We don't need 30 home developments. And we certainly don't need one co-op or one agency producing 30 homes and then a second agency with a part-time worker producing another 30 homes and that kind of thing. We really do need some level of professionalization and scaling. And although, as I say, there are some really, really strong supportive housing and nonprofit housing agencies, the YWCA would be one of them. There's a group called Atira. There's another group in BC that's Entre Chez Nous Femmes. Anyhow, I'm having a slight brain freeze as to the exact name of the Entre Nous Femmes, Between Us Women. And there's definitely a few that have gotten scale, like 1,000, 2,000 homes, but they're rarities. And to some extent, we do need a more professionalized sector, and that, ironically, especially in British Columbia, which has gone a little further than the rest of Canada, there's quite a few Indigenous organizations that are doing some of the most interesting and large-scale developments in Canada right now, which is great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Again, like if you're an Indigenous woman, are you like, woohoo? There's one development in Vancouver right now that, came out of 100 years of land claims. I'm not exaggerating, but involves 7,000 apartment units. That's by First Nations, the Squamish First Nation. And, if I'm a woman, I'm going, yay.
I want to jump back to another question that I have, which is about encouraging change. Because when we started, we were talking to ministers' staff and all of the great work you do around advocacy. And we're thinking about message crafting. So I'm wondering, what kinds of messages, when you're talking to politicians or to human beings in the street or to policy wonks or whoever it might be, what kind of messages do you think get through could be just around affordable housing or non-market housing, or it could be about gender responsive housing. Take it either way you want to go. But what kinds of ways of talking about this do you find most effective?
Well, a lot of my work has been around really basic stuff like definitions of affordability, and it comes out of the work that we did in Melbourne, and it's had some success at the federal level, but mixed success. So the federal level has been really good at getting municipalities to do needs assessment using an income-based definition of affordability that includes income categories. Yay! Yeah. When it comes to program development, not so much. And of course, it's great to talk about need, but it's even more important to meet those needs. So, if you say that 80% of the households in housing need, which is a term used in Canada for unaffordable and overcrowded, well, mostly unaffordable housing, then, that's attached to a number. The number varies in each city, but across Canada, it's about 1,050. Okay, how are we going to create and retain housing that's available? Keep in mind that we don't do weekly rents in Canada, it's monthly, 1,050 a month. How do we get to 1,050 a month? Very difficult with new development without, ongoing subsidy. But, because I'm such a numbers idiot, I need to kind of go, okay, that's the number we're working with. Let's work backwards from that number. Having said that, of course, anecdotal and storytelling is far more important. So again, I'm going to drop a link to a really cool podcast called She, Them, Us. Andrea Reamer, who runs the podcast, is such a great storyteller that works really powerfully. So what I'm talking about these days is housing that's affordable for the majority of Canadians. It's not necessarily the perfect way to define things, but these days in Canada, we really need to talk about how we can create affordable options for middle income households under 40. They can't afford to stay in big cities like Toronto and Vancouver anymore. They're moving away in droves. The biggest demographic group that's moving out are people aged 30 to 40, and the second biggest is children aged 1 to 5, who presumably have something to do with the people aged 30 to 40, I'm going to say. There may be a correlation there. So, it's becoming cities with no children in it. That's another thing I often talk about. And that's a great joy of working in Canada. Things are so bad, you can start realistically talking about cities with no children in it. And then I often tell stories. Particularly, I was speaking a couple of months ago to a group of high net worth women, of which I was the least high net worth, I believe, and probably the worst dressed person there. Very well-dressed women, I have to say. And not all of them were old, which was kind of cool. I was telling stories. I was telling stories because a lot of them were my age about what it's like dealing with aging parents and not having options for them, even if they owned a house. My mother, who was a single mother, owned a house towards the end of her life and then sold it at a certain point. It didn't help her through assisted living and long-term care. She needed help from her children. And then I talk about, my children who now are the age that my husband and I were when we bought our first house. No way are they able to buy their first house. In fact, my daughter and husband live in Berlin, where they pay $1,000 a month for a beautiful one bedroom that's close to a park and 2 tram lines and, a subway station. They're not going to come back to Canada. They'd be stupid to come back to Canada, And as I started telling those stories of sort of boomer sandwich generation stories, there was a lot of resonance. In fact, I would say that was one of the most receptive audiences I've had in terms of, what can they do? And to go back to the story I told at the beginning, I forget whether you were recording or not, there are very few investment vehicles that take an ethical approach towards housing investment. And I can't speak for other boomers, but I think we'd be willing to take slightly lower returns in return for something that's going to help society be better rather than worse.
I think that's true. I mean, I have these kinds of conversations with my mum all the time too, and that's something that really motivates her. I think there is a latent market there. It's funny you talking about
the woman
that
I was talking to this morning. I'm sorry to jump in, but the woman I was talking to this morning, she's real young. She's younger than you. She's in her 20s. You have to be young in order to be a political staffer because it's such hard work, and you have to uproot yourself and all of that kind of thing. So she's a political staffer, and I was trying to get a diverse set of people to advise on the next national housing strategy. And I said, part of what I did when I'm suggesting some names for this council is, wouldn't it be cool if half of them were under 40? And we can do it. And she got that, man. She got that in spades. So you craft your message for who you're talking to. And I didn't just do that to get that particular woman to pick up what I was putting down. I think it is really important that we recognize a new generation of experts and that we pay attention to the fact that there is at least one generation and possibly two that are locked out of secure housing because they're locked out of home ownership and renting is so terrible.
Yes. And I mean, including voices of people under 40, as you say, it's voices of people most impacted or have the longest period of time to be impacted by this changing scenario as well. So I see the value in an argument like that. And I'm not surprised she was picking up what you're putting down as a person under 40. I think I know what I'm talking about when it comes to housing. Of course I care. Yeah. So yeah, this makes a lot of sense. I was thinking before about this sandwich generation concept. It was a massive thing that came up in my PhD as well, about talking to people about density increases, not even putting the affordability or the social housing lens on it, but just densification. And the thing that got people across the line was, do you want your children to move out of home? Yes. Do you want them to move out of home within a 30-minute drive of your home? Yes. Can I do that the way that the housing system is at the moment? And the same for your parents. You speak to people's lived experience, and it's a more useful thing. I wanted to go to your book, Carolyn, about called Home Truth. And one of the questions I had about it was that I love that it's so unapologetically aimed at normal human beings in the street. It's not a hugely policy wonk, academic text. And yeah, I just wanted to know your reflection on how it's been received and how people are responding to it and why you made that decision of where you were sending the focus of the book.
It's been fabulous. I mean, my previous books, Home Truths is about my sixth book, were written when I was part of an academic career, and part of the academic career is you write these peer-reviewed journal articles that maybe 100 people read, and then you write a book that maybe less than 100 people read, and you tick that box, and then you become a full professor, and yay. But when I got back to Canada, my usual give no Fs approach had gotten amplified to 1,000,000%. So I went to UBC Press, and I've had a good experience with UBC Press before with my previous thesis into book. And the then head of UBC Press, a woman named Melissa Pitts, who I've known for 30 years, I said, the last time we spoke, which was about 20 years ago, you said you wanted mass market books. I said, I have two mass market books. I have one book that's a true crime story and one book that's a housing book. And she was so uninterested in the true crime story, which has turned out to be a whole other joy fest. But she was very interested in the affordable housing book. I was edited to tears by my editor, who very much, although she works for UBC Press, she's a historian, and she was like, I don't understand this. Make this clear. and I was like, I got back like there was red on every page, and I was like, I don't know whether I could do this. I thought I was a good writer. And every second I spent on editing it. And even then, she wasn't happy with the number of stats, but I am who I am. It was worth it. I've gotten, easily hundreds of messages, particularly on LinkedIn, from people who've gone, this is exactly what I needed for my work, which is really why the book was written. I wanted something that was, not necessarily that people could put as a stocking stuffer or something like that, but something that ordinary people who are interested in the housing crisis could read. And also I wanted something that anyone who was in any way housing related, they were a city councillor or they were a planner, but not necessarily a housing planner, or they did something with a business improvement association or a board of trade or something like that they could read and kind of use. So I've gotten tremendous, like the kinds of reviews I need. I think I got one negative review literally out of hundreds. And the one negative review was sort of, that's kind of what I expected. That's okay.
Thinking about your career, and you've done so much in housing and so much in gender for such a long time, what do you think is the most influential thing or piece of work? Like when you think about I've had 3 careers in my life, you think back on it, what is the thing that brings you the most joy when you think about I did that thing and it changed the world in a way?
Well, the story that I often tell, and I tell it because it's a real story, is when I worked for the City of Toronto, a consultant report came in saying, let's set up a $100,000 gender-based violence grant prevention program. And I looked at it and I went, no, this must be an error. I'm going to add a 0 and make it $1 million program. That was the first thing I did, because $100,000, it's hardly worth bothering. Even 30 years ago, this was 1991, when I was still in my 20s, and I knew a lot in my 20s. So added a 0, which brought it up to par with AIDS prevention grants, and there was, I think, drug abuse prevention grants too. So they were sort of health-related grants. So yeah, totally gender-based violence. Let's put it up with those two. And then it went to a subcommittee of City Council and died at the subcommittee level. Like the vote was to table the report. And at that point, I was just a poor, corrupt bureaucrat, so I couldn't do anything. But I did talk to a bunch of people, and I said, there's 17 counselors, there's 2 weeks, each have to choose a counselor and get to them. And when you talk to them, it's very much what I said earlier. You don't say, you're the class enemy or we'll bury you or something like that. You say, hey, here's some of the experiences that myself or my agency have had. And, what kinds of concerns around gender-based violence do you know of from your constituents? Or, and it went to council. And some of the people who voted against it, who were quite right-wing councillors, I don't know, it turned into this big old therapy session where, I remember one counselor, a man, talking about how he grew up with violent parents and the impact it had, particularly a violent father, and the impact it had on him. And one right-wing counselor woman talked in the third person, but it was pretty obvious that she was talking about her own experiences of having been raped as a young woman. And it passed. It passed unanimously, as I remember it. And that $1 million grant program continued until the City of Toronto was forcibly amalgamated 6 years later. And it saved lives. It unquestionably saved lives. And each year when it came time to renew the grant, we brought a couple of people who told stories about how their lives had been saved by the program. That, to me, was the most remarkable experience I've ever had, because it was about changing minds, but also changing hearts. And I haven't always been super effective at changing hearts and minds, but it was just such an obvious example of changing hearts and minds that, if I do nothing else in my life, I saved a few lives.
If you do nothing else and you've saved a few lives, that's a pretty damn big contribution. That's an amazing story.
It is. That's it. My work here is done.
Yes.
Shuffle off the coil now.
Bye. I have a question I want to ask you, which is, if you could describe a genuinely gender equitable housing future, What would it look like? How would we know if we saw it?
Good question, big question. I want to start off with an experience that I had 3 weeks ago. I was at a conference on housing data organized by Canada's housing agency, which is called the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And I'd already spit the dummy a bit about it because there was a panel that I felt, as someone who's actually written a report on housing need for the federal government, and the panel was on housing need, and I lived, a 20-minute walk from the conference venue. I was a little surprised that I wasn't asked to speak, and a whole bunch of people who hadn't written reports on housing needs, let alone federal reports, were invited. That report was quite critical of the agency that was hosting the meeting. There was a panel on construction data. Again, something I get quite excited about. It was in 2025, 5 older white men on the panel, and for a cherry on top, a white male moderator. And I posted on LinkedIn. Too bad there weren't any women on this panel, but math is hard. And, I just posted it with a picture of the panel. And got about 250 likes. I was like, all right, good. I'm glad people get it. So what would the future be like? Not that. I mean, what the future would be like is that everyone has a safe, secure, adequate home that's affordable and meets their needs. And that every aspect of the process, from building it to approving it to living in it to evaluating it, had a diversity of people, men and women, women and men, engaged in it. So sometimes, for instance, I get it, like everything to me is about gender. It's a classic, showing a bunch of Rorschach tests and it's all about gender. I mean, to me, show me a dot, a blob, and it'll be about gender. So one of the things that Canada's talking about right now is more industrialized construction, more factory-built construction, etc. And at least anecdotally, the construction industry is a bunch of aging, generally white men who quite often have the hidden injuries of gender to show it. A lot of them are addicted to various opioids because being in housing construction is very bad for one's body. And again, anecdotally, a lot of the factories that get built that build the components of housing and sometimes even housing modules in factory-controlled conditions are women in unionized jobs. And, you don't need to be enormously strong to work in a factory. So you can have a family and you can have regular work and you can have benefits and you can have all of that stuff. So the very process of creating housing has gender aspects to it. It's not just the results. And, to me, it's very much about, are there social services nearby? Is there a grocery store nearby? Because goodness knows there's still a lot of domestic work that's gendered. 2 books that influenced me a lot when I was a young thing 40 years ago were Housing as If People Mattered, which was by Claire Cooper Marcus and Wendy Sarkisian, and talked about the design of housing, and Redesigning the American Dream by Dolores Hayden, which was about the future of housing, but also work and family life. And to me, from the beginning, housing isn't just about housing, it's about community, it's about work, it's about all that cool stuff that Vienna was doing 100 years ago with communal laundries and communal food depots and childcare and, all of that stuff that was the individual work of women and still often is these days being more collectivized or certainly made easier. So that's a very long answer to what a truly gender equal city would look like.
effective advocacy or political advocacy it's about systems change, and systems change is slow and it's hard and it's often exhausting work, especially at the front lines of a crisis such as the housing crisis.
On the next episode of Homes Not Houses, I'll be joined by Executive General Manager of Advocacy and External Affairs at YWCA, Kate Whittle, to dissect the ways advocates can work alongside governments to help create the change our society needs. This series is a production of Per Capita, the independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. We work to build a new vision for Australia based on fairness, shared prosperity, community and social justice, and we are committed to providing ad-free and editorially independent content. This season is proudly sponsored by the YWCA and Australians Investing in Women, whose support helped produce the show and our research. Homes Not Houses was produced on the lands of the Wurundjeri-Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present.